We have Bryan back in here talking about some more incredibly rare Art Deco wristwatches, and there's a couple of super interesting pieces in here. Thanks for coming back, Bryan.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. First watch I want to show today is a Meadowbrook. It's from 1929. Normally this watch is 14 karat white or 14 karat yellow. This particular example is solid platinum. And Hamilton made 17 of these. So this is one of 17. There are about 6 of these known. So there's 10 or 11 out there somewhere we don't know about.
Do you think there's with some scrapped ones in there?
You know, I don't know. This kind of watch, you pick it up and look at it and you think, God, there's something special about this watch. It's heavier than a normal watch. And I think for that reason, probably a lot of them survived. Wow. They were super expensive when they came out. They were could only be afforded by wealthy people.
Yeah.
So in 1929, this watch was $360.
Crazy.
And if you bought it with a platinum buckle, it was $400.
Incredible.
So that's why Hamilton probably was only able to sell 17 of them.
And that would be considered like a cushion style case.
Cushion style case, yeah. This was one of the first watches that Hamilton named after something rather than just based on the shape of the case. So the earliest Hamilton watches were cushion, square, barrel, tonneau, based on the shape of the case. They didn't really have any sort of interesting or kind of names of a lot of cachet to them. But starting with the Meadowbrook, Hamilton began naming their watches after, in this case, country clubs. So Meadowbrook Country Club is in New York, it's on Long Island. Hamilton named a number of their watches after country clubs, or like the Piping Rock is a country club.
Is there any notable owners, since they're kind of scarce and they're pretty expensive? Did anybody notice them?
I'm not sure I understand.
Notable owners, like, because in a sense there's some engraving on them.
There is, and yeah.
Anybody? Yeah.
And actually, this one's dated 1929, and I looked up even though it's only got initials for the person who received it, and initials from the organization that presented it, I actually deciphered it at one point, but I can't remember
what
it was. It was an advertising agency, maybe in New York.
Okay.
They presented it to one of their employees. That's what I remember.
The encyclopedia has limits.
It does, yeah. I do every once in a while forget something. The next one I have is a Hamilton Gordon. This is a somewhat common watch for Hamilton. Normally the Gordon came in 18 karat solid gold. Very popular, used for corporate presentations. You see a lot from Texaco and other organizations. This particular example is in platinum with a diamond dial. And Hamilton made a little over 50 of these for the Plymouth Oil Company of Houston, Texas in the early 1950s.
And you mentioned, I think when we were talking before, you said a lot of the oil companies would just float, like...
Sure, in the early 50s, the money, they were drilling, doing a lot of exploring here and in South America, and the money was just pouring in. So when they wanted to do something really nice for their employees, they would call Hamilton and order something extra special. Not just a regular Gordon with a corporate presentation, but a Gordon platinum with a diamond dial.
Do you notice with like some of these low production watches, especially, they're almost regionally purchased because you said a lot of them went to the oil company, so it would almost be more in like the Texas area?
Well, yeah, a lot. You see a lot from Texas. You see a lot of Texaco, a lot from Gulf, and Plymouth also, especially from the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. This
is another watch, even out of the 54 or so that were made, I know of probably 6 or 7.
Wow.
So again, it's got, Grandpa's name on the back, Plymouth Oil, it's heavy, it's got diamonds on it. Watches like this tended to get saved and not scrapped.
That's pretty interesting, actually, yeah.
This next example is a Hamilton Bradford, also in platinum. The Bradford was also a very popular watch for corporate presentations. You see tons of them that are engraved on the back to an employee for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. In the catalogs, the Bradford is shown in 14 karat white gold, 14 karat yellow gold, with a regular dial and with a diamond dial. But this example is platinum. and it's the only Platinum Bradford known to exist.
One of one, huh?
One of them, as far as we know, yeah. And it doesn't have a presentation on the back, so I don't know the occasion of why it was produced and sold.
Somebody wanted to spend some money, right?
Somebody else wanted to spend some money, that's right.
What style lugs are those?
I don't know, what would you call that? They're stepped.
Stepped, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that like some sort of like stepped flared lug?
Yeah, I would say stepped and flared. That's a good way to put it.
One question actually comes to mind on these two, especially the platinum cases. How hard is it to get crowns when a crown disappears?
Well, these two watches probably came just white gold fill crowns.
Oh, okay.
Simple white gold fill crowns. Yeah.
So they never really produced crowns only for...
They did. Now, I'll take that back. On the Gordon, the other platinum watches that Hamilton made at the time that the Gordon was produced were the Rutledge and the Cambridge. Those watches came with platinum filled crowns. So you'll see them, they'll have a brushed appearance to them. They're different than the regular white gold filled crowns.
And I guess those are at a premium.
They are, when you find one, that's correct. Now the Meadowbrook came with a platinum crown.
Wow.
And this one has its original platinum crown.
That makes it extra.
It is, it does, yeah. Because that's one of the first things that wears out or falls off and gets lost. Yeah.
Some watchmaker says, oh, it's fine, just throw a crown in it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now I think we're going to be moving into some very rare white gold pieces. Go ahead, Bryan.
So I have 4 watches here: a Meadowbrook, an Oakmont, a Pinehurst, and a Flint Ridge. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier segments we did that Hamilton began naming their watches after country clubs, and then again later started after people, famous aviators, famous explorers, generals. So this first watch, the Meadowbrook, I mentioned in the previous segment, was named after a country club in Long Island, New York. Now this watch was also a presentation watch from the Cadillac Motor Car Company. Yeah. So Hamilton, again, even as early back as the 1920s, was considered to be the very top watch in America. So if a company wanted to present a special award to an employee for long service, it was usually a Hamilton. Mm. And these were acid etched at the factory. They're not engraved, so they had a special process where they would do some sort of printing of the name and the company on the back, and then they would apply acid, and the acid would etch all the logo and the lettering into the case back. And they came from the factory this way. Of course, they cost extra to do this.
Do you consider the engraving a higher quality ending result than by hand even? Or?
Yes, yeah. It's unbelievably consistent. Every letter is exactly the same depth. And they probably had the top engravers to do the plate, to do the acid etching. And the cool thing about early Hamiltons is we have production figures. We know exactly how many of these were made. We know what years they were made. I think there were about 200 of these presented for Cadillac.
Wow.
And even though some people say, well, an engraved watch is worth less because it's got somebody's name on it, the fact that we know exactly how many were made and the exact years they were made makes them much more collectible to Hamilton aficionados than just the regular Meadowbrook.
I think it's also adding something that it is a notable company in the US. I mean, it's anytime you can put it, especially a car company. I don't know if they did custom dials. I'm not familiar.
Sometimes they did,
but in the Swiss world, for example, that does increase the value of the watch. So I would think in that case it would help it also.
This next watch is an Oakmont. Again, this watch was named after a country club. In this case, the Oakmont Country Club in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. This watch, similar to the Cadillac watch, was presented by Packard in 1933.
Crazy.
Again, with an acid etched case back done at the Hamilton factory in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And again, we know exactly how many of these were produced. There were 199 of them.
Wow. Why 199?
That's how many they chose to give out in 1933. You know, this watch was $100 in 1933.
Wow.
The worst year of the Great Depression, and Packard was still doing well enough that they felt that they could afford a $100 watch, 100 of them, 200 of them, to give to employees.
Yeah.
In 1933.
Have you noticed with any of the Packard watches doing well via auction or whatever, that there is people that search out stuff like this? For example, like something from Packard after like the one sells for hundreds of thousands, and auction.
Sure, and there seems to be some crossover with the vintage car people, the Cadillac and the Packard watches.
Cool.
Yeah. Hamilton also did watches for Oldsmobile and for Studebaker.
Oh, I've heard of the Studebaker.
Yeah.
It's not the only one.
Yeah.
I think you have all the other rare stuff.
I did. I sure did. The next watch is a Pinehurst, which is named for the Pinehurst Country Club in North Carolina. Again, another golf club. Hamilton really was looking to an affluent market. So they were marketing watches that had would be known or favored by people who had money. People who were members of country clubs. So these are the people Hamilton was marketing their watches to. And by and large, Hamilton watches were much more expensive than Elgin watches, Bulova, Gruen in Illinois. So they were really looking to a wealthier market.
One question on the country club aspect. Did they ever give these away for like a PGA champion, or I guess it was roughly around that time? So
I haven't seen it one specifically for the PGA, but I see them all the time for golf tournaments.
Okay.
All the time.
I guess it's a
the
marketing
20s and 30s, right? Yeah.
Give away a free watch and
win the tournament, get
all
a gold Hamilton as being the winner of the watch. Exactly.
Yeah.
There were, I can't remember the production numbers on the Pinehurst, but it's maybe 300 or 400 in white and maybe a couple hundred in yellow. It's a very rare watch.
And you mentioned something about that watch?
It's my favorite watch of all the watches I have.
No price to take it, huh?
No price to take it. And I've had several of them. This one is unusually nice. The case is just razor sharp.
Yeah.
Everywhere. You see them a lot of times, the design starts to get worn, the corners get a little soft, but this one is just razor sharp.
You mentioned that the finish was still on the...
Right. The center case body has a frosted kind of matte satin finish, whereas the bezel and the case back are polished. And that was very typical. You see watches, older watches nowadays, they've almost all been polished everywhere. But most of these watches came with 2 or 3 different types of finishes on the case when they were brand new. And so it's very unusual to find a watch that's, in this case, almost 95 years old, that still has all of its original finishes.
Not being over polished.
Yeah, you wonder about some guy spent $90 to $100 on this watch, wore it a few times, and then never wore it again.
Yeah.
And it's been sitting for 90 years somewhere, never having been worn more than, a month at the most, maybe. You wonder, why did he wear it? Maybe more than that.
With the ones that are polished, also, you almost wish you could go back and tell them,
exactly.
Don't do it.
Right.
Leave it alone.
That's right. So this next watch is a Flint Ridge. It's 14 karat white gold. It was also made in yellow gold. And so the appeal of this watch, according to Hamilton's advertising, was this was an ideal watch if you played polo. Again, an affluent sport aiming to capture an affluent market. So this watch has a covered bezel that there is a button on the upper right lug. So when you want to tell the time, you push the button. It flips open the lid so you can see what the time is.
What is that considered, the lid itself? Is it like a shutter?
It's a honey case.
Honey?
So similar to it's a honey case. Yeah. So, if you could afford to play polo and you needed a solid gold watch to wear while you're playing polo, then the Hamilton Flint Ridge was the watch for you.
Would it really take a hit, you think, or is it the white gold aspect would just dent immediately?
No, I haven't seen any really that have been dented up, so I don't know if people really wore them while they're playing polo.
Probably not.
Probably not. The protection would be from maybe if a guy fell off the horse or something or got hit with one of the poles or whatever. But, I see them, they have wear, people wore them, but I've never seen one that's been really like it was dropped or hit in athletic competition before.
And what is the mechanism inside? Is there?
It's a spring. It's a series of springs. That's right. It's the bars. The button is held in place with a spring, and there's a spring that pushes on that and pops it open. As a practical matter, when you're wearing it, it's fairly inconvenient.
It looks like it.
Kind of hard to get it to flip open enough to really see the time. I don't wear this watch very often because it is
not
inconvenient. It's not very practical. It sure is cool though.
And you mentioned color-wise, there was how many in green, how many in white?
I think there's 1 or 2 known in green. White, there's probably 400 or 500 in white and probably 300 or 400 in yellow.
Okay.
So all told, probably under 1,000.
The green, you've seen one, or?
I have not seen a green.
Yeah. You know where one is?
No.
Okay.
Interesting. Hamilton, they had an entire dealer network, and they would send out letters every couple of months to their dealers saying, hey, we're bringing out this new watch. We're going to send you samples. We've tested it in small areas and it's selling like hotcakes. Well, they sent out one of these letters about the Flint Bridge saying that they sold a bunch and they were sold out. But yet we know they made less than 1,000 of them. So that letter was probably a little optimistic.
Yeah. Deceptive advertising.
A little bit, yeah. A little sales puffing.
Yeah.
But it was the Depression, so they were doing anything to kind of try to boost their sales. This watch is from 1930.
And the Depression, well, that's why they switched to some of the gold-filled stuff, kind of.
Later in the Depression, Hamilton, before the Depression, Hamilton watches were always either solid gold, sterling silver, or 14 karat gold fill. They never made a base metal case, or a 10 karat gold fill case, or a rolled gold plate case. Starting in 1934, they started making 10 karat gold fill cases.
Yeah.
Just so they could get a watch priced under $40.
Makes sense.
Makes sense, yeah. You know, because the Flint Ridge with the 19 jewel movement was $150
Yeah.
in 1930.
Even at the $40 price point back then, I mean, the people buying this are going to be at minimum middle class, kind of upper middle class.
Correct. You know, Elgin and Bull at the time, when Hamilton was selling their minimum $40 watch, there were Elgins that were $12.
Yeah.
There were Bulvas that were $15. So
Yeah.
even Hamilton's cheapest watch was more than double what some of the other competitors' prices were.
Yeah, that's crazy. Really a premium product.
Yeah. Okay, this next group is somewhat eclectic. There's not a particular theme here, but these are just 3 early Hamilton wristwatches. Hamilton offered its first men's wristwatch in June of 1917. And basically what it did, it took existing movements that were targeted for ladies' watches, which it had plenty of, and put them into men's-sized cases, which were becoming popular right around World War I.
Yeah.
So rather than develop and design their own cases, again, Hamilton just took their existing movement and put it in a case that was already available from the case makers. So this first watch is one of those watches from 1917, and Hamilton simply called it military wristwatch, a wristwatch for men. Very exciting.
Yeah.
And with World War I going on, they kind of capitalized on this military watch theme, thinking men going off to war, men who've come back from war, had recognized the utility of having a watch on their wrist while they're overseas. And so Hamilton's advertising really focused on the military aspect, motorsports, forestry, people working outdoors in various trades, surveyors who would find a wristwatch to be of great use. So they first started out using a grade 983 movement, which was a large O-size movement that they were using for ladies' chatelaine pocket watches.
Okay.
And then they also used the 19 jewel movement, which is a grade 985, which is a gorgeous. It looks like a railroad pocket watch movement, but only smaller size, and it's inside this watch.
Timekeeping, how did it do?
Fantastic. Yeah, they're just phenomenal timekeepers.
Yeah.
You can get them as accurate as you want, as accurate as a pocket watch.
You mentioned, so this was probably a military service watch, most likely?
Well, yeah, in fact it is actually, because it's engraved to the
Trench, yeah.
original recipient on the reverse.
Very cool.
And he was the 12th Aero Squadron. He was the adjutant of the 12th Aero Squadron, stated April 27th, 1918.
Very.
And I actually looked him up. He was in the Army Air Corps, I think. Served out of a couple of the bases. He was trained, did some training in San Antonio. And I don't know if he ever went overseas.
And you mentioned the acid engraving. Was
No.
this the case, or was
No, this was probably engraved by the jewelers because it was presented to him presumably by people in his unit.
Okay. Very cool. Question on the trench watches also for Hamilton. Rough idea. What percentage do you think actually went to service, and what percentage were just sold into the consumer kind of market?
You know, I would guess probably maybe a third have some sort of military connection.
Really?
These were, provided by the Army itself or by the government, but very popular with people going overseas, and they were used overseas.
Yeah.
But Hamilton did not have a contract with the government to provide watches for soldiers.
That's surprising that
This time.
Elgin
Elgin did.
marketed as a military watch.
Right.
A lot of times, most of the time, those are sold as a trench watch
Right.
without the engraving.
You know,
It's that few.
right. You know, Hamilton's minimum movement at this point was 17 joules, whereas the Elgin's were 7 joules. So I think cost-wise, the government felt it was more cost-effective to go with the less expensive Elgin because they could buy a lot more wristwatches to issue to soldiers than they could a $50 or $60 Hamilton watch, when the Elgin's only cost $15.
Yeah. Was that ever an issue in the field with the 7 joules? Because just timekeeping wise?
I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm sure they had watchmakers, people out there who were probably full-time trying to keep these things going in the mud and the rain.
In the trench.
Yeah, and the percussion from the guns and everything. I'm sure they was very busy trying to keep watches like this running.
Very cool.
There were, as far as the 983 movement and the 985 movement, there were only a few hundred of these made.
Wow. How many do you think survived from that in a sense? I mean,
In the 985s, I've seen maybe 10 or 12
wow.
in both sterling and solid gold.
Solid gold. Wow.
983 is a more common movement. I've probably seen several dozen 983 movements. Later in 1919, Hamilton decided to make a movement specifically for men's wristwatches. Still O size, so still the same size as this watch. They made some changes, minor changes to the production to make the movements a little more easier to produce. That came out in 1919, and they made about 2,000 of those.
Was there any decrease in quality with the men's
No,
watch?
there were 17 jewel movements over the same
level,
same
finish,
quality, everything, yeah. The demascening on the 981 movement, which was the movement made specifically in 1919, is less elaborate.
Okay.
But it still has big gold jewel settings, screwed in jewel settings, big heavy compensated balance, are just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So just not as elaborately damaskeened as the 985 is, which looks like a 950 watch. It's gorgeous.
So even though it was, in a sense, more of a tool watch, still
Exactly.
then focused on the quality.
It did.
Very cool.
Now this next watch, for a long time, we didn't know the name of it. And we didn't know anything about it because it was never in a Hamilton catalog. But about 10 or 12 years ago, a little piece of paper surfaced showing this watch. And it was an insert that was mailed out to dealers to be stapled into last year's catalog. So this watch is called the Rectangular.
Wow.
So one of the first watches, Hamilton named them after the shape of the case. Cushion, square, barrel. This is a Rectangular. It came out in 1927 and it was a mid-year introduction. It is solid 18 karat gold and the case is hand engraved. And Hamilton's literature at the time said we've had a demand or call for a more expensive, more finely finished watch than appears in our regular catalog. So we're offering this 18 karat gold, elaborately chased watch.
Is there ever, with the hand engraving, is there ever any famous engravers that came out of that in a sense? Or is
Not that we know of. I'm sure, this case was made by Solidarity, so they just had their regular people working at the factory engrave. They had a pattern to go by.
Yeah.
And it was just their regular people that was their job, was to engrave the bezel and engrave the sides of the case.
It's kind of incredible that just a regular person put out a piece of art like that.
Sure, and anonymously, we'll probably never know who these people were that worked in the Solidarity factory that engraved these cases. Even the inside of the case is engraved.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. That's especially unusual.
Yeah.
That's nothing I've seen before. How many of this?
There were about 250 of these in white and about 67 in green.
Wow.
Solid green. There's only one solid green gold one.
No.
No.
Wow. That is incredible.
There are.
It was a short production.
Yeah. Fortunately, we have production records for Hamilton. It was only illustrated in that one insert from 1927. And I'm sure Hamilton, they were sold by special order. And for a couple of years afterward, you could probably still order this watch through the early 1930s. I have one dated 1932.
Okay.
So I know, for 5 or 6 years, it was kind of available if you asked.
Yeah.
For any, because they probably ordered cases, probably in batches of maybe 50 to 100, and then assembled the watches and sent them to distributors as they got orders for them. So it was possible for many years they had cases sitting waiting for movements, waiting for somebody to order one. They wouldn't put the watch together until they had enough orders to justify putting the watch together and sending it out.
In that case, did some of these cases end up, when the company shut down, basically, end up getting in the market? Or?
Well, there's literature from the early 30s especially where Hamilton makes notes that they had leftover cases for certain models. They would send them back to the case maker to be melted. And they would get a credit against future orders.
Yeah.
So we do know that, you know, they would, I've got records that saying so many watches of this model were made, say, you know, 300, but we sent back 110 cases to the case manufacturer so that we know that the real number is 190s.
Yeah.
Ultimately made.
Is that something painful for you to read?
A little bit, but you know, but then I've got a lot of those watches, so then I know, oh, mine's a lot rarer than we thought it was. We know how many were melted.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. The green gold one, you know where it is?
I do know where it is.
Okay.
And it is not for sale.
It's with you.
No, it's not with me. Interestingly enough, this watch was also used as a presentation watch for the 1920, maybe the 1927 World Series.
Wow.
So there is one known presented to, I think it's the Athletics. Can't remember where they were. They weren't obviously.
Any notable players in that case?
The one that I've seen engraved for the World Series may have been for the scorekeeper.
Okay. Well, yeah. Nobody big in that sense.
But that's the only one we've seen surface with that engraving on the back for the World Series. Undoubtedly, there were more.
Yeah.
Surely they made 20 or 30 presented for the World Series. The next year, 1928, Hamilton, of course, had the Piping Rock, which was presented to the New York Yankees.
Yeah.
That's a very famous watch and has the New York Yankees on the back along with baseball. Of course, those watches were presented to Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Bill Dickey. So quite a few of those watches have survived. I've seen.
These are the ones that have astronomical prices.
Absolutely hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Because was actually presented to a Yankee player, you know, the most famous Yankees team of all.
Is there any literature from the factory of who, well, like the serial number that they were actually issued to in that sense? Like, is there any serial number?
Not that I've ever seen. I mean, Hamilton, we've got some literature that says so many were made, the engravings were done at the factory, the players' names were engraved on the side of the watch. Here's what they cost. Here's what the engraving cost extra. Here's when they were shipped out. We have no information on those watches.
Cool.
Yeah, really cool.
Nothing in exact detail where we can say this serial number is.
No, but we've got stories from people who worked at the factory who mentioned, yeah, Babe Ruth's watch came back in 1940, whatever, for service, and I worked on it. I remember working on it.
Wow.
You know, we fixed it, put a new crystal, or replaced the balance, there was some damage to it, and we just shipped it back to Babe Ruth.
That's a pretty insane story, actually. Yeah. I wonder how nervous they were.
But they had every part of the world there. Yeah, so as long as the case wasn't damaged, they could just replace the dial, the hands, the crown, the crystal, the strap.
Yeah.
You know, most people at the time, you know, these watches were utilitarian, so they didn't care if the dial got replaced or if the dial was refinished during part of service. Or got a new crystal, or you replaced a strap with a more modern strap. They didn't care. They just wanted the watch to look good, work, and stay on the wrist.
That's why you mentioned, I couldn't remember if you mentioned that before, there were some factory refinishes, right?
There were, absolutely. Hamilton kept thousands of dials in stock.
Mm-hmm.
So if for some reason your watch couldn't be repaired by your local watchmaker, and if it went back to the Hamilton factory in Pennsylvania, they would completely redo it.
Yeah.
If the dial had the smallest speck of dirt or dust or tarnish, Hamilton would replace it.
Yeah.
Similar to what, if you send a watch back to Rolex or Omega.
What they used to do.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna keep your old bad dial, and they're gonna put, because they know the customer, most customers are gonna want their watch to look brand spanking new.
Yeah.
So that's what they did.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What do we got? This two-tone.
This next watch is a solid gold barrel. Again, one of the early Hamilton watches that was just named based on the shape of the case. Nothing more. And this watch, actually it's all solid white gold, even though it looks two-tone. We've got some records that Hamilton made some two-tone watches. This watch, if you polish the center case, it's going to turn white again.
Wow.
But if you let it sit long enough, it turns this yellowish green color. And we've speculated perhaps they used a slightly different alloy for the center case body.
Wow.
To make the lug stronger, to keep the strap from pulling out, or to keep it from wearing and having the strap come off. We really don't know.
That is very interesting.
Very interesting.
Everybody would assume.
It's weird though. You know, these cases were made by Fahey's, and we've got other solid white gold cases made by Fahey's for other watch companies that do not turn green or yellow like these do. So it's really a mystery.
Makes it even more rare, I guess.
Yeah, we just don't know. So this watch, it may have been polished at some time, but I've had it for a long time, and it's always been this color, and I like it. This color, I like the dark green center. It's really a very, very distinctive look.
It's sneaky too, though, because
it is, yeah.
It is actually white gold. But you wouldn't guess that.
Correct.
Very cool. How many total production you said?
The barrels, I think there were 500 or 600 made in solid gold. That's it.
And do all of them do that? You said?
Every white one I've ever seen will eventually turn dark like this.
Right.
I've only had 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah.
And they've all been like this. If you polish it, it'll turn white, but the white color it turns is still a little different than the bezel and case body.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it really is interesting.
They let that get by, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for some reason, either the case maker or Hamilton ordered that way.
Mm.
There's some purpose to it. Obviously,
Yeah.
it's not accidental. We'll never know, probably, until we find a sheet of paper that tells that.
Yeah. Is this literature still coming out? In terms
Yes. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a large group of material that popped up on eBay.
Mm.
Some out of the way place in Pennsylvania. A lady had gone to an auction, a local small auction somewhere in Pennsylvania, and bought boxes. Got home and opened them up, and there were thousands and thousands of pages from the Hamilton factory.
Wow. Great.
Memorandum, letters, production records, detailing which strap came on a certain watch, which hands came on certain watches. All of that material was in there.
And some of that stuff that came out wasn't in existence.
We had never heard of any of this before.
Wow.
There was a large group, when Hamilton kind of pared down its operations in Lancaster in the 70s or 80s, a lot of it just went in the dumpster.
Wow.
And a lot of it was rescued out of the dumpster, a lot of it was intercepted before it got thrown away, compiled by a doctor, and eventually Rene Rondeau, a noted Hamilton collector expert who specialized in electrical watches, gathered all the information, by hand organized it, and made tables of all the production figures for the early watches. So that's how we know how many of these watches were made, mainly due to Dr. Revell, who saved the records, and then Rene Rondeau, who compiled them all for us.
A legend of Hamilton, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly. But then again, less than 10 years ago, this thousands and thousands of more pages just popped up out of nowhere.
Wow.
With so much more information. So there may be more.
It's always the hunt.
Always not. That's the most exciting part, really.
Yeah. And were you able to, after for example, you said matching straps, it helped you figure out what should go with what?
It did, absolutely. Most of the early watches, the Hamilton watches, came with black pigskin straps, for the most part.
And the buckle would basically be what needed to be matched in.
Correct. Most of the early Hamiltons came with solid gold buckles if they were solid gold watches, and the Goldfield watches came with Goldfield buckles.
Did the style of buckle change much between models, or are they pretty?
Pretty much the same. They changed over time.
Okay.
So the earliest Hamilton watches came with, normally they came with Hadley straps, and they were not signed Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
The early buckles were generally made by Hadley, and they were not signed Hamilton. Hamilton, it doesn't appear they started using signed straps and Hamilton signed buckles till probably 1934, 35.
And so there's certain years of what buckle it basically is, right? They went on all the watches, and it was one particular buckle.
Generally, yes. Generally, Hamilton used Hadley almost exclusively up until maybe the late 30s or 40s.
Okay.
use some other brands as well. But even the styles of buckles, there's such minute differences in the styles of buckles that you can kind of date the buckles a little bit about how they're constructed.
Very
That's
cool.
a very fine art.
Is there any rare examples out there that you can think of?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the platinum watches, like the Platinum Beauties we talked about earlier, normally came with an 18 karat white gold buckle. It also came with a platinum buckle.
Wow.
So they duly matched the case material with the buckle.
What's more rare, the buckle or the watch?
You know, Hamilton platinum buckles, I've seen 3.
Oh, okay.
In 25 years, I've seen 3 signed Hamilton platinum buckles. In an 18 karat, I've seen maybe 2 or 3 in 18 karat that are signed.
Wow.
Hamilton.
Crazy. Yeah.
Weird.
None of them survived.
Yeah, you wear your watch for a couple of years, the strap wears out. You know, as a consumer, you probably didn't notice that it came with a solid gold buckle.
Yeah.
Or you forget. And you need a new strap, you take it off, it breaks, you throw it away.
Yeah, especially not being branded.
Yeah, you go to a jewelry store, you just buy the next, reasonably priced black watch with a gold-filled buckle on it.
Yeah.
And the 18 karat buckle got tossed in trash, probably. Crazy.
Yeah.
A platinum Hamilton buckle today, $500, $600, $700 if you can find one.
Yeah. For material of $30.
Yeah, it's got $30 or $40 worth of metal in it.
Yeah.
But they're just not available anywhere. You just have to get lucky, yeah.
Very cool.
This group of 3 watches were all named after famous people, at least famous at the time. Probably not many people these days have heard, but Hamilton, starting in about 1929, recognized aviation was getting really big. People are starting to fly now. You've got commercial air service starting. The world's opening up, air travel and airplanes have enabled people to go places they normally haven't been. And this, even more so than commercial air travel, there was a lot of exploration of air travel. So we could fly over the Amazon, we could fly over the North Pole, we could fly to the South Pole, we could fly around the world, we could fly across the ocean. So Hamilton recognized this and began naming their watches after famous explorers or famous aviators. Kind of cash in on this immense interest in aviation. This first watch is called the Bird, and B-Y-R-D, not B-I-R-D. So it was named after U.S. Navy Commander Richard Evelyn Byrd. He was a famous aviator. In 1926, he undertook a flight over the North Pole. Now, more recently, evidence has come out that maybe he didn't quite make it to the North Pole, but at the time, it was assumed that he was the very first person to fly an airplane over the North Pole. So this was huge news worldwide. And so a few years later, when Hamilton introduced this watch, it named this watch after Commander Byrd. Now, this watch contains a 401 movement, which was Hamilton's very first rectangular shaped movement. Before this, all Hamilton movements were round. Mm-hmm. And that, some ways, limited the styling and the size of the case. But with the introduction of this rectangular movement, they could kind of alter their case construction and do more longer case styles that weren't quite as wide and bulky. Now, the 401 movement was based on the Illinois 207 movement. Mm-hmm. In January of 1928, Hamilton bought the Illinois Watch Company of Springfield, Illinois, for various reasons. And Hamilton adapted the Illinois 207, which was a great movement, and began producing the 401 movement, which has 19 jewels. So they made some changes to the Illinois movement, some changes that made it a little bit easier to produce, less costly to produce, and also upgraded it from 17 jewels to 19 jewels. So you mentioned about whether or not Byrd wore a Byrd watch. We don't know. It seems likely that since Hamilton named the watch after him in 1930, while Byrd was still alive and very famous, surely Hamilton gave him one.
Yeah.
Now, on all of Byrd's explorations, South Pole, North Pole, he used Hamilton watches for the expeditions. So they used 992 pocket watches that came in special gunmetal cases that were supposed to be extra protected from cold, snow, and Hamilton has very precise records of how many of those pocket watches were made for each expedition, what the dials looked like. They were luminous dials, what the special cases were like, and probably even which serial numbers were used on the movements. Several of those watches are still around, and I know someone who has a couple of them. And when they turn up, they're expensive, because there's still a lot of people who have a lot of interest in this golden age of exploration in aviation. So there's a lot of collector interest in things like that. The radios used in the expeditions, some of the flags they used in the expeditions are still around and are very famous.
Very cool.
So on Byrd's 1926 flight over the North Pole, which was, we think, later proved to be not exactly over the North Pole, his co-pilot was a man named Floyd Bennett. So this watch is the Hamilton Floyd Bennett, named after Floyd Bennett in 1930. This watch has a rounded movement rather than the 401 rectangular.
Yeah.
Byrd and Bennett, after they returned home from this 1926 flight over the North Pole, they were both awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Coolidge for their exploits.
That's very cool.
Byrd lived until the 1950s and became an admiral later in the service of the United States Navy. Bennett died about 1930 or 31, very shortly after the watch was named after him. There was another expedition, it's maybe a polar flight, international type polar flight or a contest, in which various countries engaged in this flight up north, and one of the airplanes was lost, and Bennett gathered. Well, no, he was not. He went to the rescue. So he was organized somehow this rescue expedition and died during the expedition to rescue the other airplane. Very shortly after that, Hamilton changed the name of the watch to the Captain Rice, which we think was named after an Amazon explorer associated with Harvard University. We're not exactly sure if it was named after Alexander Rice. Probably, we just don't know for sure. Hamilton's records aren't very clear on that.
Is the reason they switched it is it because he died?
Probably because he died, and maybe the family decided they didn't want the watch to be named after him, you know, grief or sadness or whatever. We're just not really sure. Hamilton makes a note that says we're sending out stickers. Every box, if you got the Hamilton watch, had the name of the watch, you know, yellow sticker.
Yeah.
So Hamilton noted they were sending out stickers that said the watch is now the Captain Rice and cover up Floyd Bennett.
Oh,
We just don't know.
Nobody really
knows yet.
Value and production numbers?
The white bird, I think there are 300 or 400 made. You know, you find one, they're going to be between $5,000 and $6,000 for a bird. Came in yellow also. Yellow's rare. I've seen more yellow ones than I have white ones. I don't know why.
Really?
Even though yellow is more common, relatively speaking. Captain Rice, Floyd Bennett, again, just a few hundred of them were made in white and yellow. 3,500 to 4,000.
The co-pilot's always worth
A
less,
little
right?
bit less, yeah. You know, the bird was $150 in 1930. The Captain Rice, also $150 in 1930.
The same starting price.
You could buy several nice used cars in 1930 for $150. Or even maybe a rundown house for the same price. You could buy one of these nice Hamiltons for.
Another question about them. How often was there any kind of idea of how often people bought it just because name association with it, or
we don't
was
know.
it the look of it? There's not really any popular magazines in that time.
No, Hamilton would introduce these watches and say, we're excited, we're going to sell a lot of these. And we've got year-by-year production records from every year these watches were produced. These watches were sold from 1929 to about 1934. And they never sold more than 50 or 60 in any one year for the entire country.
Yeah.
They were just too expensive.
Yeah.
But there were still certain people who had a ton of money in the early Depression. They're out there driving Cadillacs and Duesenbergs and going to the opera, and they're playing polo, they're going to the racetrack, they're playing golf at the country club. So for them, these watches were easily affordable.
Yeah.
This next watch is a Glenn Curtis. So this watch was named for Glenn Hammond Curtis, who was an early aviation pioneer, kind of credited with inventing the seaplane. He was big into early motorcycle production. Was very instrumental in really early aviation. He was constantly feuding with the Wright brothers about who had
first airplane, I guess.
Well, not so much the first airplane, but his feud with the Wright brothers was over control surfaces, about how to make the plane bank and turn. The Wright brothers had a patent on a system called wing warping, where it adjusted the tension in the wings to make the aircraft turn. Glenn Curtis really kind of favored movable control surfaces. You know, you see planes now with flaps and ailerons. That was kind of Glenn Curtis's deal. And the Wright brothers sued him, he'd sue the Wright brothers. You know, there were long protracted court battles between Glenn Curtis and the Wright brothers about how to control the airplanes and make them turn and climb, descend. Curtis, for a while here, held the world's speed record, land speed record for motorcycles. I can't remember what the speed, it was well over 100 miles an hour. And this was in 1911, 1912.
Yeah.
And he had motorcycles that would do 120 miles an hour. That time, this was just, you know, an unheard of velocity. And Hamilton named this watch after him. And Hamilton makes a note that he actually wore the wristwatch named after him, the Glenn Curtis.
Is it engraved special?
We assume so. I've had a friend that contacted the Glenn Curtis Museum in New York, and they don't have the watch. They have his other watches.
Oh, they do?
That he owned, and I think he even got his wife's and his mother's watches.
Mostly Hamilton?
Waltham and maybe a Longines.
Okay.
But Hamilton's letter about this says that Hammond Curtis quit wearing his pocket watch, which they have, and started wearing his wristwatch. He wouldn't have worn it very long because he died very shortly. He was in court and had an attack of appendicitis and died later that day or that evening.
Crazy.
So presumably he would have been wearing the watch when he died.
Yeah.
We don't know.
One question I have about this, the Tiffany coat,
This
was this on this model, or is this just specific for
Well, Hamilton,
low end, basically?
yeah, so this watch normally came in 14 karat white gold, 14 karat yellow gold, and those would say Hamilton on the dial.
Yeah.
But beginning in the early 1920s, Hamilton had a partnership with Tiffany Company of New York. Tiffany was a high-end retailer, top in America at the time, and so they chose certain high-end watches to rebrand with the Tiffany dial and to sell in the Tiffany store in New York. So Hamilton supplied their regular models of watches, but instead of being in 14 karat gold, they made them in 18 karat gold to sell to Tiffany.
Yeah.
Tiffany put their name on the dial and they were sold in their store. So yeah, Hamilton and Tiffany partnered up to sell 18 karat gold Hamilton watches in New York.
So this is still considered the Glenn Curtis?
It is, yeah. Hamilton's records call it a Glenn Curtis, and they say specifically made for Tiffany and Company, Tiffany and Company on the dial, Tiffany and Company on the case, and a correspondingly much higher price. So these watches were $160, $170, $180 in 1930. So Hamilton made 26 Glenn Curtises for Tiffany.
Wow. Yeah. Is that kind of typical of that era?
They are. Hamilton never made more than 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 watches for Tiffany for any specific model. They're just very rare. I bought 2 Tiffany Glenn Curtises at a watch show. In about the same watch show in about 30 minutes.
Wow.
2 of the 27.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my best find ever. Just talk about coincidence and randomness.
2 at the same time.
2 at the same
guy?
No. 2 different people.
Wow. Yeah. Sometimes.
This one with the applied gold emerald dial, and that one had the luminous dial.
Wow.
I'll never get that lucky again.
Value wise on that?
You know, 5,000 or 6,000 probably.
Okay. So almost above the captain.
Almost above the captain, right?
Nice.
And the bird, yeah.
Yeah.
But Hamilton had a whole series. In this series, the Explorer series is what they call the watches with the 4-1 movement. There was the bird, There was the Andrews, which was named after Roy Chapman Andrews, who was a paleontologist, explorer, and who was believed to be the inspiration for Indiana Jones.
Oh, okay.
The Wilkinson, we're not sure who that was named after. The Erickson, we believe, was named after Leif Erikson, the early Viking explorer.
Yeah.
There were 2 Goldfield models of Stanley and the Livingston, who were named for Henry Morton Stanley and Dr. Livingston, who were African explorers in the 1870s and 80s. So we do know that. In this aviator series, there was the Floyd Bennett, Captain Rice. There was the Glenn Curtis. There was the Langley, named for Samuel Langley. He was director of the Smithsonian. He was also an early aviator and did a steam-powered airplane. I'm trying, there's probably 1 or 2 more in that series. But Hamilton was very, very conscious of what was going on in the world with aviation exploration, and chose to name watches after people who were in the news at the time.
Were they kind of the first in that sense?
No, probably Bulova was first with the Lone Eagle in 1927.
I guess they saw them doing well with it, and then
probably
copycat.
Yeah. You know, Lindbergh.
High-end copycat.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Lindbergh kind of was associated with Bulova, but Longines kind of capitalized on Bulova. I think Lindbergh used Longines watches on his flight.
Right.
For some reason, Hamilton didn't contact or didn't have anything to connection with Lindbergh. For some reason, they went a different route.
The Lindbergh thing becomes interesting because when we were in Maui, I didn't realize he was actually buried on Maui. We saw his grave.
That's right.
By accident.
Buried in Hawaii. That's right.
Yeah. Very cool.
His grandson is still very involved in aviation. Lindbergh's
Oh, okay. Cool. I didn't realize that. Very cool. Thanks for stopping by, Bryan.
My pleasure. Thanks for hosting me.
You can check his stuff out at Instagram, ArtDecoWristwatches, or you can check out his website, ArtDecoWristwatches.com. Simple to remember. Check him out.